How we doing today, Planet Earth? My name is Ian Fox, and today we are going to be discussing the brand new Dead Space remake. This game is one that I have been cautiously looking forward to since the very moment that I heard that it was happening. Mostly, this is just because I don't really like EA. I don't feel like you can trust the company all that much, but a big part of this also had to do with the fact that I wasn't really familiar with Motive as a studio aside from their work on Battlefront 2 and Battlefield 2042. I definitely had hope that this game could turn out to be absolutely incredible if done right, but with EA, you can never really be too sure. The original Dead Space that was released all the way back on October 14th, 2008 was pretty much met with critical acclaim from day one. It was a game that was highly inspired by what Capcom did with Resident Evil 4, and instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, they just borrowed the most popular elements from that game's design, put it in space, added a whole host of terrifying aliens, and added a few things here and there to make the gameplay feel unique. Dead Space was so popular that a sequel was a no-brainer, and eventually we got Dead Space 2, which did exactly what a good sequel should do. When developing DS2, the devs took all of the popular elements from the first game and simply improved upon them for the sequel. What they also did was, when thinking about how to handle certain situations in DS2, they took the few flawed elements from the original and tweaked those to make the overall gameplay feel much more fluid. DS1 is a game that, in all reality, really doesn't have that many flaws. So it made perfect sense to the developers that when making DS2, they should just continue moving forward with what they did right the first time. When Dead Space 2 came out, just like the first game, it was met with critical acclaim pretty much from day one, and a lot of people consider Dead Space 2 to be superior than DS1, and I am one of them. At the time, Dead Space was a growing franchise that seemed like it had nothing but a bright future ahead of it as long as the developers at Visceral had just maintained their course and continued to do exactly what they did the first two times. Unfortunately, when it came to the third installment of the series, EA started to dip their hands into the pot and interfere with the direction of the franchise. And thus, we have Dead Space 3.
It's the biggest piece of dog shit.
When Dead Space 3 released, the story of success was not exactly the same. DS3 is very often, and rightfully so, looked at as the black sheep of the original Dead Space trilogy. This is for many reasons, but the main ones are that the game's setting and atmosphere were basically flipped on its head, turning it from a survival horror game with some action elements to a third-person shooter action game with very little horror at all in the hopes of trying to bring in a broader audience and thus more sales. Second to that, the title was released during the rise of the microtransaction, and considering how single-player titles tend to focus less on finding ways to get the player to spend more real-life money, EA wanted to fix that. So they made Visceral Games design the entire weapon crafting system around buying parts with real-life cash so that you could make the craziest and most powerful of weapons. When DS3 inevitably didn't do all that well, EA blamed Visceral for its failure, eventually shut down the studio, and Dead Space as a franchise sat dormant for a decade. This is what I was worried about when it came to this remake, because EA has completely obliterated any sort of confidence that they won't try to screw over the customer at any opportunity that they can, and I really didn't want to buy another $70 corporatized game.
Oh God! Oh God! Oh!
Eventually, though, I started hearing reviews. I woke up on the day of release and I just saw all kinds of positivity about the title. The Dead Space remake is perfect. The Dead Space remake is the best remake ever made. They nailed the remake. I strongly recommend the Dead Space remake. Seeing all of this just made me even more hyped, but to be honest with you, I was still doubting it, because in my mind, there has yet to be a remake ever released that is better than the 2002 Resident Evil remake.
Oh my God, it feels so good.
Nevertheless, it still felt good to feel excited for a Dead Space game again. Eventually, I got my hands on the remake, and this game is so goddamn good that before I even tell you why it's so good, I'm going to tell you that you need to absolutely drive yourself to the store right now and buy yourself a copy of this game. Within the very first mission of this remake, every single worry that I had went straight out the airlock. Dead Space 2023, in my mind, encapsulates every single thing that a remake should be. In short, the best remakes always do the following things. They respect and are faithful to the original, and instead of taking things away, they improve on what already works, as well as improve and expand the areas where the original was lacking. It became very clear to me that when Motive set out to make this remake, they had a specific formula in mind, and that formula was simply to mash Dead Space 1 and Dead Space 2 together. And you'll see what I mean by this throughout the video. One of the things that was lacking in the original for me was that Isaac Clarke was a completely silent protagonist. His role as a silent protagonist was meant to put you more directly in Isaac's boots, as he is pretty much just a vessel for the player to experience the story itself. Sorta like Master Chief in the Halo franchise. It actually wasn't until Dead Space 2 where we all heard his voice for the first time, and Isaac Clarke was able to fully become the iconic character we all know and love. Well, Motive pulled a real big brain play, because in this new story, Isaac is no longer a silent protagonist. The best part about it is that they brought back Gunnar Wright, who was his original actor from DS2, and he did an amazing job playing Isaac once again. Isaac also got a face redesign that basically makes him look just like his actor, which, if you ask me, huge improvement. Because Clarke didn't ever talk in the original, it always felt like he was being ordered around by the other survivors as he ran around the Ishimura completing various tasks. Now that he speaks for himself, it feels like he takes a much more active role in the plot than he ever could before. This is best represented when, instead of being ordered around by the people he's working with, he takes the initiative to tell them what needs to be done to solve the problem and volunteers to handle it himself.
Can you handle it alone?
Sure. Fix the centrifuge, get the fuel running, then do a full restart. But you'll need to stabilize our orbit from there.
Standing by. Fast as you can, Isaac.
There are a few moments here and there where Isaac's smartassery that I loved so much in DS2 shines through as he's about to dive headfirst into a dangerous situation, and it cracks me up every time.
The Leviathan has a 10 kiloton mass. Do you really need me to tell you this is a bad idea?
Well, I'm all out of good ideas, so guess what's left?
Just a heads up for all of you, we are going to be discussing some things that I would personally consider to be pretty spoiler heavy, so if this is the kind of thing that you would like to avoid because you have not played the game yourself, feel free to click on the timestamp that is shown on screen for you right now. Due to the fact that Isaac was a silent protagonist in the original, the story in the background had to be really fleshed out so that it would still feel the story had substance, but in the end, it left a few of the characters feeling a little bit underdeveloped. Nearly every single character is expanded upon in the remake to some degree. Even characters that were previously only relegated to a now dead person that were previously only in an audio or video log. The first one being the Metal Man himself, Isaac Clarke. One of my favorite things about his character in this game is that we get to see his progression of his attitude towards the situation he's in. It's important to remember that Isaac Clarke is not a Master Chief. He's not the Doomslayer, and he's definitely not a Resident Evil 5 Chris Redfield. Isaac Clarke is just a regular-ass dude on what was supposed to be a very regular, everyday repair mission. So at the start, when he comes face to face with these horrors for the very first time, they are as terrifying to him as they would be to any one of us.
The Ishimura's overrun with... they're fucking monsters. You didn't hear anything?
What? No, the comms are still out.
Throughout the story, though, as he takes on more and more of these monsters, he begins to build a new level of confidence.
I've got the Ishimura's cargo cranes. They can move half of the mining gear, no problem. If whatever's down there wants to wrestle for the marker, I'm in.
The other thing about our boy that has been expanded on is his relationship with Nicole, as well as some information about Isaac's family origin. Throughout the story, we learn that Isaac was raised as a unitologist by his mother in his early years before eventually leaving the church. This is pretty significant when you consider basically every single terrible thing you see in the game is caused by the unitologists, as they believe this outbreak represents convergence, which is their form of Judgment Day. Isaac's personal ties to unitology, in a way, are pretty much the reason for him going to the Ishimura in the first place, as when his parents meet an early fate due to his mother's fanaticism, he blames it on Nicole.
Stop. Stop it. Just stop talking. said she was herself again. You said she would be better at home. I trusted you. God. You might as well have killed him yourself.
This adds so much context to the intro message that we were shown in the original, and deepens Isaac's reasonings for going to see Nicole. He wasn't going to the Ishimura just to reunite with his girlfriend. He was going there to own up to his mistakes and get her back. By the end, I really felt for Isaac as a character. In a moment of grief, he lashed out at his only remaining loved one and ruined their relationship. So he embarks on what turns out to be the nightmare of a lifetime, all to save his lost love, and in the end, is left all alone having to face the reality that she was dead before he even arrived. Quick side note, but there is an Easter egg in the original game that hints up to Nicole's eventual fate, and I'm very thankful that they brought it back in the remake. Whenever you come across a save station, if you save at least once in every level and you line up the first letter of every level name, her fate is spelled out clear as day for you. Nicole is dead. When I played the original for the first time, I can assure you I definitely did not know that this was a thing, but I'm really glad that they brought it back into the remake. It's just a small little neat detail that a lot of people aren't really gonna notice. One of the other ways that characters have been expanded upon is Hammond and his relationship with the members of his security squad. Just like in the original, Hammond's squad does not last very long at all, but in the remake, one of them still manages to be a recurring character throughout the story. Chen is the Asian fella that gets taken down right at the start of the game during the iconic moment where the Necromorphs appear for the very first time, and as you come to find out in the story, those that die typically don't tend to stay dead. Not long into the game, Chen begins to pursue Hammond and Daniels throughout the Ishimura, and as the story continues on, you really get a sense that Hammond really cared about his team. He considered them to be his personal friends, and he begins to have the attitude that Isaac and crew must succeed in their mission so that his team's sacrifice can mean something. When he manages to trap Chen in an escape pod, he can barely look at his now infected friend in the face.
His face. I'm not seeing things, right? That's Chen.
You can't help him, Hammond.
These recurring moments where Hammond is faced with what Chen has now become alongside the marker's manipulation make him start to lose it, and ultimately his eventual fate is left far more impactful because of it. Unlike the original, where he just gets pummeled to literal pieces behind a thick piece of glass, he now goes out taking his fallen friend down and out of his misery. To be completely honest with you, my jaw hit the floor at this moment. I felt like this was incredibly well built up to, and was way better than the original way it was done. In terms of Kendra Daniels, she really didn't get any sort of character expansion as far as I could tell. She was a bitch in the original that was just trying to sow distrust in the group for pretty much no reason at all, and that's exactly the same here. That's fine with me though, because considering that she was always planning on screwing over the group from the very beginning, it makes sense that she wouldn't want to get personal or try to trust anybody, because she was going to screw everyone over, like I said. Another addition that I felt added to the whole experience was the addition of a cutscene here and there. In the original, whenever there is something happening with another character or something the developers don't want you to miss, it would always happen on the other side of a large window or glass wall. While this still does happen in the remake from time to time, some scenes have been given their own proper cutscene. One of the best examples is in what I believe to be the second mission, where you were introduced to the Infector for the first time, and instead of things going down behind a window like in the OG, the moment was replaced with a far superior cutscene. Another good example is when the game throws some more subtle cutscenes at you, like when Dr. Mercer hits you with stasis. You still have some control in the camera, but your movements are so slowed down the scene can just play out around you. There are other scenes that previously used to play out exclusively in audio and video logs that for the most part have been completely replaced with hologram recordings that make the environments where they take place in feel much more lived in. There's even a couple of characters from these old audio logs that were expanded on as well, as they can be encountered throughout the story in a variety of ways that I've previously mentioned. Just through these various types of logs, I feel that it even became pretty clear that there were a number of people that were actually surviving on the Ishimura for a lengthy period of time before Isaac showed up. I think this is awesome, as in the OG it always seemed like the infection just washed over all the survivors really fast. All of these expansions to the story only serve to make the story and universe of Dead Space feel all the more complete, and I love everything that they added to the story in this remake. All of these details just make the whole of the Ishimura truly feel like there really were hundreds of people just going about their lives before everything went to hell in a handbasket. Enriching the overall story and making it much more interesting, in turn, just helps make the game even more immersive because it really helps you get into the setting and the atmosphere. Just like in the original Dead Space, the atmosphere here is unparalleled. Despite the fact that I was fully going into this knowing what to expect, I still couldn't help but feel terrified the entire time I played through it. For one, since the game is set on an alien-infested ship in space, you feel incredibly isolated. There is nobody around but you, and there isn't anyone coming to help. As the old saying goes, no one can hear you scream in space. Every single room and corridor throughout this massive planet cracker has been painstakingly recreated from the OG to instill fear and paranoia during every single second of gameplay. The enemies you encounter can come from anywhere, and on many occasions you can't see very much in front of you as a lot of the power throughout the ship has gone out. The thing about Dead Space as a series though is that what is often the most terrifying is what you can't see. That's exactly one of the things that Dead Space has always been so good at utilizing. The dark, the silence. One of my favorite parts of the earlier portion of the game was when I had to reroute power, and I needed to have both the doors and the elevator powered, which meant I had to manually turn the lights off. Having to deliberately make the room dark as hell to be able to progress made the moment very tense for me, because I know that anything can leap out at me at any moment in time. When the game only plans to throw a couple of enemies at you, chances are the volume isn't going to ramp up. Things will stay somewhat quiet so that you can still listen for an enemy sneaking up behind you or busting through a vent. The developers also did a really good job with utilizing really loud noises when the action is about to ramp up to a 10. Sometimes you'll just be going about your business and probably letting your guard down because the game is quiet and you haven't seen any enemies in a while, and then typically moments like these seem to be used for when a pretty decent amount of enemies are rushing at you all at once, which really adds to the chaos and tension of every moment it occurs in. Of course, a massive part of what makes Dead Space so terrifying are the enemies themselves. Each and every different type of necromorph has its own unique look and attributes that make each one a different level of threat. The first one that you were introduced to is the standard slasher. These guys are typically thrown at you in small packs, often with one distracting you from the front while others are potentially sneaking up behind you. At a distance, even in decent sized groups, they can be pretty manageable, but if you let them get too close, they may potentially charge at you, making them much more of a threat. What I like about the standard slasher is that now in the remake, they have multiple variants of this enemy type. For example, it seems to me that the slashers that look naked go down in less shots than those that look like they're wearing some sort of security uniform.
Damn nigga, what you doing out here with all this ass? Double cheeked up on a Thursday afternoon.
As you get later into the game, there will be a few slashers that pop out wearing white armor that is similar to Isaac's that makes their body much more resistant to any amount of damage. Of course, I can't forget about the one slasher variant that is a bit stronger than all the others that is created by the Infector. This one has more of a green look to it, and it takes a few extra shots to bring it down. Speaking of the Infector, what you come to quickly realize is that this thing is spreading the Necromorph Infection through dead bodies, which means that any corpse you come across throughout the entire ship may very well become a threat to you later. As brutal as it is, it's a really good idea to stomp out any unattended bodies to prevent this from happening. This is because the infectors are really sneaky, and they'll create a number of slashers if given the chance that can catch you off guard if you aren't paying attention. The next one is the Lurker, which are all basically infected babies that can crawl around on all surfaces and shoot projectiles at you from 3 little tentacles. These things are an absolute pain in the booty when they appear while you're trying to complete an objective, because they'll just plink away at your health from afar and will constantly move around while hiding their weak spot from you, making them harder to kill. Speaking of babies, next up we have the Pregnant, which is similar to the Slasher aside from the fact that it moves a bit slower and has a giant glowing sac in its midsection that when shot will kill the Necromorph, but before it dies it will birth out a bunch of little swarmers that will latch onto you given the chance and nibble on your flesh until your health runs out. Whenever there is major chaos going down and you're fighting for your life, there's usually one of these guys thrown into the mix, and if you hit it in the wrong place, the swarmers will come out and it'll make it much harder to fight back against whatever is attacking you. The Pregnant is definitely up there as one of the enemies that is on the more annoying end, but at least the swarmers can be avoided if you hit the creature in the right areas. The Leapers are a variant that is not always, but is most commonly found in zero gravity areas because they're a bit more agile than the rest of the variants. These guys are a bit limited with their mobility in areas that have normal gravity, but in zero G, they're a pretty decent threat if you aren't paying attention, because they will launch themselves at you and hit with a quick strike as they quickly glide past you. In those previously mentioned non-zero G areas, they are a bit easier to take down as their torso and arms are a much easier target to hit because they won't be moving nearly as far or as fast. There is one enemy that is all about the speed, and it's called the Twitcher. Since the Twitchers are infected soldiers with stasis units, they basically have the ability of super speed, making them much more intimidating in a pinch than other variants. You really do not want to get cornered by any of these, as they can make very quick work of you if there's more than one of them, especially if they are in the combination with any of the other variants. Another enemy variant that is always down to make a boom whenever it pops up is the Exploder. The Exploder carries around this giant glowing sac that, when shot, will explode, taking out both the creature itself as well as anything standing within its immediate vicinity. What I like the most about this enemy type though is that if you sever the sac from the arm of the monster, you can use telekinesis to use it as a grenade, lobbing it at whatever stands in your way. These ones are definitely most effective when in a big fight because there's often a lot of movement coming from these enemies, and sometimes you just can't line up a shot on an Exploder that's heading your way, and when it gets close to you, it blows you to bits. The Exploders are at times not very much of a threat, but when they begin to close that gap on you and you feel like you can't do anything about it, it definitely gets your blood pumping. The next one we have is likely what I consider to be the creepiest out of the bunch, and that's the Divider. Just by looking at the Divider, you can tell that it's basically made up of a bunch of human body parts that have been deformed and have a mind of their own. When whole, this variant will charge at you and do a pretty good amount of damage if it manages to land a hit. However, if it loses a limb, the entire thing will divide up into a bunch of smaller body parts that will attack you all at once, hence the name. These creatures aren't found too often throughout the game. I'd say that there are usually only a handful of them that you'll actually come across, but these things can be pretty difficult to fight against because once they divide up into a bunch of smaller pieces, those pieces then have to be dealt with individually. Otherwise, they will continue to pursue and attack on their own. There is actually one brand new Necromorph that is unique to this remake, and I don't know what it's called exactly, so I'm just going to call it the Spitter. The Spitter looks a lot like a standard Necromorph, aside from the fact that its chest seems to be open and exposed where there is some sort of sac that they use to lob acid at you from a distance. The acid does become easy to dodge after a bit of practice, but if it does hit you, it'll slowly burn away at your health while slowing down your movements pretty significantly. From what I could tell, these guys didn't really pop up all that often. It seems like they were designed for a specific purpose, which is ranged attacks, but there aren't many opportunities where things are open enough for them to be used as much as the others. So with that in mind, they're a welcome addition, as is any other, but I didn't feel that they were a mind-blowing new enemy that changed up the experience in any meaningful way. The final two Necromorph types kinda serve more like mini-bosses than standard enemies. The first of these is the Brute, which is this gigantic monster that is completely armored on its front side, making it difficult to hit its weak points. When encountering this one for the first time, it's a one-on-one fight, but after that, these big dudes will show up out of the blue while you're in the middle of combat with lesser enemy types. Like anything else, on their own, they can be difficult but manageable, but if you happen to run into a brute while already in combat, then you'd best get ready to run, because chances are you're about to have a very hard time staying alive. Lastly, there is one necromorph that is so unique from all the rest that there is quite literally only one of them in the entire game, and that is the Hunter. The Hunter is pretty much an extremely beefy slasher, but what you learn very quickly when fighting this thing is that you aren't going to be able to kill it. No matter how much you damage this thing, it is going to regenerate everything that it's lost and continue its pursuit until it's lost your scent. Whenever this thing comes into play, everything gets very tense, because chances are it appears in an area where there is already another infected that you'll have to deal with. So in all reality, when the Hunter shows up, you have no choice but to run and evade. All of these necromorph types do add a lot of variety and horrors that you have to deal with, as I just explained, but I think my favorite part about all of them is that their visual designs heavily pull from something called body horror. Every enemy, aside from, I'd say, the Brute, still has very human features. These necromorphs, while threatening and very alien at the same time, are also very familiar. Just by looking at them, you can tell that these used to be people that have had their bodies taken over like vessels and horrifically mutated in a bunch of different ways, as many of these creatures' faces and parts of their bone structure have remained intact. Due to these mutated yet still humanoid forms, they just trip what I assume to be some sort of primal instinct in my mind that's telling me that these things may look human, but are 10 times creepier because I know that they're not, at least not anymore. There is another aspect to the Necromorph Infection that I personally find very interesting, and I don't think I've heard anyone else mention it, but like, do we really know what the Necromorph species is supposed to look like? Let's look at John Carpenter's The Thing, for example. Part of what made The Thing so terrifying in that film was that we never truly get to see what it looks like. We only get to see how the thing imitates people, and when exposed, begins to mutate that specific victim. In Dead Space, it's largely the same thing. We have this infection that is ravaging the Ishimura, but almost everything still somewhat maintains a human form. So really, unless this has been explained in the series previously, we really have no idea what the necromorphs are really supposed to look like. This unknown factor only makes the necromorphs as a whole even more scary, because what they truly are is still somewhat unknown. Becoming any one of these monstrosities just seems like one of the worst fates imaginable. Like, just think about this for a second. You grow up having a decent childhood, you go through all your years of education, all the while developing your own goals and dreams. You graduate college and land a job on the most famous intergalactic planet cracker known to man, and just as you get there and are kicking off your career, everything goes to hell, and everything you have ever accomplished in life led up to this. All of these factors play massive roles in why I think Dead Space's atmosphere and setting is absolutely incredible and will have no problem scaring your socks off. It's oppressive, it's scary, it's brutal, and most importantly, it is incredibly fun to play. The gameplay in Dead Space as a franchise has always been nothing less than an absolute blast, and thankfully, the remake is no different. When it gets down to the nitty-gritty, the most important thing that the developers at Motive had to nail was replicating the OG's combat. One of the things they had to keep in mind is that Isaac is the metal man. He is one heavy mofo, and his movements need to replicate this in action. By using his very heavy stomp, you can take out downed enemies on the ground without much of a fight, as long as there isn't more than one. His stomp feels like it has some major power to it, since when in use, it will very often dismember whatever it is that happens to be on the business end of it. It's also useful for cracking open any crates so you can get all the goodies inside. One thing they greatly improved from the original is his standard melee attack. Using his melee in DS1 was always something that you really wanted to avoid at all times because it was extremely weak. Well, things is different now, and it's time that I told you a story. I learned pretty early on how they had changed the combat for the better, but it wasn't until later in the game that I got an actual chance to see how effective it can really be. It went a little something like this.
I'm gonna fuck you up.
Be honest with me, would you ever square up with a Necromorph? I'd be willing to bet the answer is no. I am very thankful that Isaac finally has some power behind his punches. Of course, it still shouldn't be your go-to, but at least now it feels as though if I'm in a situation like this one, where I've got no ammo and my back is to the wall, I can still have a fighting chance. Now when it comes to your main form of combat, the way you go about dispatching enemies is much different to how pretty much every other game in existence is played. When facing off against an enemy, it is much better to aim for the limbs and dismember them than to aim for the body like we're all used to. This is something that they hammer into you a few times after your first encounter with the slashers at the beginning, where you can see the iconic cut off their limbs sign in blood. I think the fact that the OG developers chose to have you dismember the enemy's limbs to be able to take them down was one of the biggest brain plays they could have possibly pulled. When you're already making a game about aliens that are already unique in themselves, and then you add a new way to take them down that is unique as well, that just makes your gameplay like nothing else that I've ever played before. Just think about this for a second. Can you even think of another game where it's more beneficial to dismember the limbs of the enemy rather than to aim for the torso and the head? Well, the answer is that you can't, because it's not a thing. And if for some reason you can think of an example, please just play along and let me be happy. Since you do a whole hell of a lot of dismembering throughout the game, you need to have a good variety of tools to be able to get the job done right. One of my favorite things about Dead Space is that nearly every weapon you come across is basically a power tool that has a specific purpose in this universe. It's easy to forget that once you start laying down the hurt, Isaac is still just an engineer. So it's always made perfect sense that pretty much everything he uses is something he'd possibly use on a day-to-day basis. The first, and my personal favorite, is the plasma cutter. And when you get this thing, instead of just picking it up off the table, a nice little cutscene plays of Isaac assembling his murder tool. These new little scenes for when you get a new weapon now occur for every weapon that you come across, which is a very welcome change to how you'd have to find a schematic to buy new weapons at the store in DS1. This one's my favorite because, in my opinion, not only does it look the coolest, but it's very versatile. It's a precision weapon for sure, as its rounds aren't very large and can require a second to line up a shot, but it's incredibly satisfying to take down enemies with. The second weapon you come across is actually the only one that is truly a gun, and it's the pulse rifle. This is also the first weapon to follow the trend of having multiple firing modes, as the primary for this weapon is fully automatic. In the original game, this was a very formidable weapon, but in the remake, even after getting a decent amount of upgrades, it seems that it just isn't as good as it used to be. That is, aside from its secondary ability that functions as a grenade launcher that will absolutely decimate anything in its wake. I'm glad to see that they at least gave the pulse rifle the same secondary firing mode as the one they upgraded it to in Dead Space 2, because the DS1 secondary wasn't very useful. After the pulse rifle, we get our hands on the Ripper, which easily became one of my favorites in the game not very long after getting it. I remember using it in the original, but for some reason in this remake it just hits different. I think that this may be because of the graphical upgrade that is present in the remake, where when you damage an enemy, a chunk of flesh will be ripped off, leaving an exposed bone, because it really feels like I'm chopping these monsters up. The Ripper's primary attack will launch a saw blade a few feet in front of you so you can chop off an enemy's limbs from a short distance. And if you use its secondary attack, it will launch the blade across the room and it will ricochet around, chopping up anything that it comes into contact with. The next weapon provided to us is the flamethrower, which admittedly I do not believe is the most useful of tools. It is a good fallback option, of course, if you truly have nothing to use, but I find that I prefer to use this against only a couple different enemy types, those being the Swarmers and the Divider. When you're being swarmed by a bunch of different moving enemies, it can be hard to keep them all at bay all at once when they're all running around tickling your ankles. After that, you get the contact beam, which is a very powerful weapon that is basically just a giant laser gun. It has a bit of a charge up, but once this thing lets loose, it will destroy anything in its way. Not only does it dismember enemies quickly, but if you do happen to hit their body, it will still do a good amount of damage to them since the damage is constant due to it being a laser. It does have a secondary attack that charges up a shot and launches it, and upon impact creates a small explosion. I don't even think I upgraded this one at all during the game. It's one of the most effective from the very second you pick it up. The line gun is the second to last weapon you get in the game, and admittedly when you first get it, its primary firing mode is kinda useless unless the enemy is almost right up in your face and moving in a straight line. However, the secondary firing mode really is something special. In Dead Space, you can't always watch your back because your attention is focused on whatever is right in front of you. So what you can do is fire a wall-mounted laser at any surface and basically create a trap for an enemy to walk into. If you got a big brain and can think creatively, this weapon can be really fun to screw around with. Lastly, we have the Force Gun, which is exactly what it sounds like. When firing its primary, it basically launches a huge gust of air that is strong enough to rip all of the skin off of any necromorph that stands in your way. It's really nasty. One of these things will just come running up to you, and within a split second, it turns into what I can only describe as a gelatin target dummy with all of its human organs exposed. The secondary fire on this one is very strange. I'm not entirely sure what it's supposed to do other than hold enemies in place, because it fires this little blue ball that stalls everything that it comes into contact with. This is one of the ones I used more as a last resort, but it's definitely effective in its own way. One thing that was expanded on from the original when it comes to combat was the way telekinesis is used. Previously, telekinesis was used to solve puzzles and move objects around, but in Dead Space 2, the developers introduced using telekinesis to launch sharp projectiles at your enemies to dispatch them with ease. The remake perfectly recreates this, allowing you to use a variety of sharp objects as well as a necromorph's very own sharp severed limbs to take out your enemies with a single shot, hilariously impaling them on whatever surface they get stuck to. In terms of changes to the Ishimura itself, there are a few things that the developers at Motive did that I chose to not mention earlier because I felt that they would fit better in this portion of the video. The first thing that they've changed is that whenever you're playing through the game, you will notice doors and loot containers every now and then that are locked with a number on them. These numbered containers can't be accessed until you have unlocked a higher level of clearance. This means that if you want to get this loot when you do have the clearance, you may have to backtrack all the way from where you currently are to find these rooms and containers to loot. However, I do feel that the game forces you to do enough backtracking on its own that I didn't really feel like I had to go looking for them very often. The biggest changes to the Ishimura come in the form of greatly improved traversal of zero-G areas. In the original game, whenever you were in a zero-G area, the game forced you to use this clunky system where you had to aim at where you wanted to go and then launch yourself in that direction. In the remake, they just brought over the system from Dead Space 2 that gave Isaac Clarke rocket boots, allowing him to much more freely and smoothly traverse zero-gravity areas. This is a massive change that improves the experience a lot, in my opinion, because those zero-G areas were always kind of an eye roll for me in the OG game, and a lot of those areas were fortunately overhauled as well. Early in the story of the original game, when the Kellion explodes, you can see it from above, but are only limited to the hangar walkway. In the remake, because of the rocket boots, this area has been greatly expanded upon. You can now fly freely around the hangar, looking around for loot and just exploring. One detail that I loved from this part is that you can visit the wreck of the USG Kellion, and if you fly over to where the cockpit was, you can see the charred corpse of Johnson, who was the woman that was killed when the Kellion exploded. This game is absolutely brutal, and I love it. The best part of this entire sequence was that you actually get to fly outside the main hangar of the Ishimura, and it is freaking awesome. Never did I expect them to allow us to fly outside of this massive ship, but I love the fact that they did, because it really just shows how tiny Isaac is when compared to the whole thing. The devs also used the DS2 flying mechanics to improve on a couple of sections in the original that weren't the most engaging gameplay-wise. These sections are the two where you have to man a cannon on the side of the Ishimura and protect it from asteroids, and then later in the game from a giant space necromorph. In the remake, these sections have been completely overhauled for the better, as in the section against the asteroids, you enter what I can only describe as the trench from the Death Star, and you have to manually line up and take out the asteroids so the automated defense systems can calibrate and kick in. The other big change that they made was that you basically fought the giant space necromorph in much the same way, except for the fact that it can destroy all of the defense turrets, forcing you to use your regular weapons to take it down while avoiding its heavy damage attacks. With all of these expansions on the story, the setting and atmosphere, and the gameplay, this remake is freaking awesome. To be completely honest with you, I could still talk for another hour and a half about every single little detail or every little thing that I loved about this game, but if you have made it this far in this video, you just need to play it yourself if you haven't yet. Just like the original, the Dead Space remake is an absolute must play, and I cannot recommend it enough. As someone that was previously unfamiliar with Motive's work aside from the good work on Battlefront 2 and whatever the hell it was they supposedly did on Battlefield 2042, I can now say that I am very confident in this studio's ability to handle Dead Space as a franchise, and I am very much looking forward to seeing what they do next. For starters, I would very much like to see a Dead Space 2 remake that is as improved upon and expanded upon as this one was. And since Dead Space 3 did not follow the initial vision that the original developers had for it, what I would like to see is Motive throw out the original Dead Space 3 because it wasn't very well received anyway, and take it upon themselves to create a new story. Because if they succeed with Dead Space 2, then they will definitely succeed with Dead Space 3. I know that there is a lot of buzz around the topic right now, and to be completely honest with you, I think that a Dead Space 2 remake is a surefire thing. We may not know it yet, but chances are it's gonna happen. My reason for thinking this is that this is EA we're talking about. This game is a massive success already, and EA is not going to pass up the opportunity to capitalize on that. So really, when the Dead Space 2 remake inevitably does come, we kind of just need to hope and pray that it is just as good, if not better, than this remake. If you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions, or anything like that for me, you can leave that down in the comment section down below. I love reading your guys' comments. I read every single one of them, and I really like interacting with you guys down there. I think it's always interesting to see what other people think about these same topics. Until next time, though, I appreciate every single one of you for taking the time out of your day to give my video a watch. If you enjoyed, please feel free to click that like button and that subscribe button so that way you can stick around. And I will catch you all in the next one.